Let me ask you this: where in your vision, how can I think commitment to superstructure ideology when, if we're examining political work of a militant organization and there's a confusion or there's a kind of dispute which is of an ideological nature internal to the organization itself, like let's say, for example, one group wants to ban, one group wants to embrace a certain form of electoral strategy, and they succeed. They succeed precisely because of their class dominance, let's say, in determining the shape of the organization. I only use that example because it highlights pretty much a fissure which occurred within DSA in the United States over the national kind of careerist and aspirational members using their power to push against the local coordinating activity of BDS, boycott, divestment, sanctions of Israel, for Palestinian solidarity. That act had the trappings of bourgeois ideology associated with it, right? In other words, how can you escape the connection to theory when you're engaged in a local struggle? You can't. And I know that you probably would agree with that. So my question is, in that sense, what is political education as theory itself? Because, okay, maybe not only as theory, but how do you do as the Maoists did, in a certain sense, deprogram class and ideological baggage that we all bring into political work, right? How does that function for you? Is there a specific kind of designated, is there what Gramsci called organic intellectual in your vision? What is this? To me is philosophy, right? This to me is theoretical struggle within philosophy. I mean, a philosopher within a political militant movement needs to be able to theorize not merely analysis of the working of the value form, of processes of capital accumulation, or to describe processes of domination of capital, to describe its insidious impersonal structure of domination. That's important that the philosopher be able to analyze this and sort of give people the conceptual tools to understand this, I think is very significant. But isn't, to shift back to your terrain, the critique of ideology also is a critique of ideology of the class struggle within the militant group itself, which is connected to the superstructure, is it not? So in that sense, I don't see theory as not having stakes when we understand militant struggle as itself a process of what Badiou would call maybe subjective purification in a certain sense, even though I'm not in love with the theory of, or the notion of, purification. Okay, but nonetheless, you do need something like that, in my opinion. I don't know if you agree.
Okay, so I think now we're leaving the discussion about how to assess the kind of the history of the Lacanian left, where we stand today with regards to it. I think we established, I have the impression you agree with me, we established that there is a kind of sequence of kind of theoretical experiments with both fields that has ended, or at least doesn't seem so fruitful anymore, even though there are results that we can still use. And we were kind of discussing that fringe moment between, okay, has this ended? What are we still using? What are we putting into question, right? And I feel like this is a bit the debate that this has become. I presented you with some hypotheses which are pretty much based on my experience and, militant organizations that I'm kind of close to. But they're just hypotheses. I mean, exactly as I proposed before, I'm saying that I think the field is now open to this sort of question, which is starting from a place that is closer to political practice, right? And I'm understanding a response in the sense of something like, okay, but what about all the good things in the previous paradigm, if you will, right? About, being able to tell apart what you call them, bourgeois trappings of certain strategies versus, proper radical strategies, and the role of theory in doing this, and, the role of a sort of intellectual within the political movement. Isn't that class struggle in theory, being able to tell apart good from bad positions? Again, I think we go back to my point, and I think it actually proves my point a bit, because, for the last sequence, there has been a very specific debate between psychoanalysis and philosophy, in fact, not politics, but psychoanalysis and philosophy, which is, Lacan says he's an anti-philosopher, then Zizek says, well, but in an age where every philosopher is an anti-philosopher, he's kind of the negation of philosophy, so he's a philosopher of a new kind. It's all about showing that there is philosophical dignity to Lacan, right? And that's actually what facilitates the relation with Marx. There's philosophical dignity to Lacan, then there's connections to Hegel. There are connections to Hegel, there are connections to Marx. And your question seems to start from that position. Look, there is philosophical dignity to political struggle, philosophical dignity to analytic ideas. And I think that's the idea that there is a kind of immanent surplus to these fields that naturally invites the other. I think that's very much a kind of an operation or an image of thought that is part of this previous sequence that, in my opinion, is coming to a close. Because I can bring a much more practical, down-to-earth argument, which I see in clinical practice every day, and which could now be imported through certain very regulated analogies or regulated transformations, as Miller used to say back in the day, when he was a Lacanian Marxist or something of the sorts. Analogy that goes through a different place. Because, in the clinic, the whole problem is that I have words and concepts and ideas in my head that are associated with certain cases, examples, traits, right? So I know that a hysteric will say things like they're not satisfied, this is not it, I want something else. They will probably hail against some authority or something like that, right? Can I act based on that concept in the clinic? That's a kind of philosophical description, right? It's a rational concept with traits, attributes to that concept, right? Can I act on that in the clinic? No. Just because the concept coalesces into this sort of philosophical or proto-philosophical construct outside of clinical space, and that's useful. In actual clinical practice, I need to suspend that, and I need to reconstruct traits and structures from within the actual concrete practice, concrete speech that I'm hearing. In some cases, even though externally these traits seem very similar to what I know to be hysteria or obsessive neurosis, when you put it in the context of that specific person's speech, that person's history, it can be something totally different, right? Some people associate perversion with a bunch of, kind of hard, sometimes even evil or kind of almost unethical behavior. And sometimes it appears with a totally different presentation, different trapping. You even yourself made a bit of that distinction. Is it bourgeois or does it have bourgeois trappings, right? I think that people who started to see that perhaps there was a different paradigm to explore in the relations between theory of subjectivity and politics, I mean, even like the beginning of the post-Althusserians, they had that idea. For example, Rancière, when he was talking about, like, what French workers were doing in the 18th, 19th century when they finished their day of work. They weren't doing peasant poetry or workers' art. They were doing bourgeois art, but there's something going on there that you shouldn't get fascinated by the surface, by the trapping of what they're doing. You should pay attention to the structure, and then you can see what's novel about it, right? I think there's an intuition to that, which is very much alive in clinical work. Like, don't get seduced by the surface effect, by traits that imply that, that thing should be identified with something you should never mess with, or having that sort of resistance against exploring the phenomena from within. And in politics, that's very hard to do. And I'm sad to say, like, you might say something like, but isn't all leftist problems also ideological problems concerned with superstructure or whatever? Yeah, but if you don't have any singular tools to deal with what happens in militant life, they're all the same tools that you use to deal with phenomena that happen at a distance from you. You're not implicated in them. You're not part of it in the same way you're part of a leftist organization or project. There's nothing singular about it. That's quite weird, right? And I don't know the name of any operators within the leftist corpus, considering very different traditions in the left, to help us operate in that confusing in-between, where perhaps something in the surface appears very foreign to us. It has very right-wing tones. It has some problematic trappings. But you need to look into the actual structure in the context of that particular history, and then you might see it for what it is, what actually is structuring that situation. So being able to tell those things apart, right, which is almost like a theory of militant countertransference, being able to not resist this sort of kind of discontent in how things look, right? It's very useful to be able to tell apart. Just because you told me now that something looked bourgeois, I have no idea. I'm not engaged with it. I'm not listening to people. I'm not aware of the particular situation. We shouldn't want to be able to make those judgments if we're doing politics. We want to make judgments that are situated judgments. That's what makes them political. So going back to your point, right? The fact that philosophically I can claim these things, that's the whole problem. Exactly like clinical work. Yes, I know what you mean by bourgeois. I know the attributes associated with it. That's what philosophy does. When it conceptualizes under its own conditions of, rationality, transmissibility, academicism, and quite often, you're required to, extract these things into this kind of higher plane of discussion or abstraction. But when you're doing clinical work, I cannot start from there. I need to start from the abstraction that is going on inside a patient's speech, no matter what signifiers he or she is using. The same, I think, could be said of politics, right? Political philosophy can abstract and have all these attributes associated with what is proletarian, what is bourgeois, but in actual political practice, you cannot start with that. So I understand your remark, because I think you're right. I mean, I think that there is something quite significant in the resistance that you pose. Like, okay, what about philosophy? Like, we have such a nice, psychoanalysis has landed such a nice place, or has enforced our important place within political struggle. Isn't this other thing going to depose us, take away our place, right? And the answer, yes and no. Yes, I think it does put into question if it is philosophy which is best tasked to listen in a very singular sense I wouldn't know how to describe, because we don't know yet what that means. Perhaps, at least in the Lacanian left, this new Lacanian left, what would it mean to develop a theory of political listening, right? It's quite interesting that we have a theory of the party as an analyst. We have no theory of what political listening means. We're all about intervention into the debates that philosophy has shaped. We're not very good at allowing ourselves to be in a position to see how situations shape themselves, right? So there's a new position there, and I think it does take us away from a comfortable place as theorists, as philosophers. And no, it doesn't depose philosophy because new questions emerge, right? It's very hard to make good analogies, good connections between a clinical practice and the concepts that are used in the practice and the concepts that are used in militant practice, right? Whatever scale it is, just to go back to your previous point of, isn't this localism? No, whatever scale, are we talking about government? Are we talking about international movements? Okay, in all those scales, there are difficulties with dealing with this sort of singular constructions in their own terms, rather than using concepts that, even if we don't want them to be, if they're treated philosophically, they tend to be a bit decontextualized, right? So, yes, I think philosophy has many new tasks, but not some of the old ones, right? And I think your remark, your question goes straight to the heart of the matter. There's new resistances also, right? A new need to convince others that this is a new moment in this connection between psychoanalysis and politics, and that everyone involved needs perhaps to reassess how these things could go together, both politics, psychoanalysis, and philosophy.
In a way, I've always been interested in kind of resurrecting a theory of neurosis, which is directly tied to the class formation, right? So like you have a thinker like Edmund Burglar, right? Early Freudian inner circle, and develops a kind of theory of neurosis, which absolutely is connected to a kind of class formation, right? So there are, consistent sort of bodily structures which align to a class. Now, I feel as if that relay system, or that kind of structural thing itself, is sort of what you are putting into scrutiny in a certain way, and I like that you're putting it into question, right? But I mean, but then again, I also think that you can definitely derive a theory of political listening, which would be able to better discern the consistency of the appearance of, like, say the appearance of ideological forms which somehow repeat and reappear across political situations within specific conditions. So that's interesting to me. Now, the other thing that interests me is the question I always have regarding this whole free association thing. My question is very simple. How do you create the means by which you can say, how do you sort of reproduce the structure of free association within the field of politics? What does that look like? And how do you sort of, how do you create those conditions? Is that then almost becomes kind of like a blueprint for political militants, or a blueprint for an organization to imitate or to model? In a certain sense, it's kind of like the I don't know. Yeah, I want to know what you think about that very much. And then finally, you're totally right. The interesting thing about the interest that people had after Seminar 17, Lacan's theory of discourse, is what is the analyst discourse for communist politics, centered on the question of the master and the mastery. Whereas, as you know, the discourse of the analyst actually treats the problem of mastery quite well, treats it in a way which, but still there remains this problem, and Zizek's whole thing that the capitalist discourse is the modern master's discourse, so the master's discourse hasn't gone away, so we have to sort of think a proper treatment or handling of the problem of the master's discourse ultimately. And that was a very productive debate. You'll remember in Less Than Nothing, Zizek himself was admitting that he could never resolve this aporia. He could never quite resolve it, right? And I don't think anyone did resolve it. But I think what you're saying is interesting, because you're coming at the problem from a completely different point of view. So you're almost, and I know you don't like the discourses, but would you then say from your standpoint you'd have to sort of rearrange the math themes in order to adequately get out what a theory of political listening within the analyst discourse would be?
Hey, man. Yeah, I think you ask very good questions. That's the sort of thing that I'm currently interested in. I think that those are all open questions. What to do about the discourses? How does class analysis kind of interact with? Sorry, I'm just going out for a cigarette here. How class analysis interacts with, analytic listening when you're in a more political context. I think they're all really good questions. Some perhaps more useful than others. Like even though it's pretty much an open field for development, I think some might be more interesting than others because, for example, take for instance what you said about the discourses. I think Zizek has been at it for many years. I think we can also make kind of a theory of his own, can periodize his approaches to the discourses. It wasn't like the main object of analysis early on. At least it was mostly, actually, it kind of was, right? The thesis that you can think Stalinism through the university discourse was very important for him, as he recently mentioned. Then there was a kind of shift to, okay, what's more propositional about the analyst discourse for politics? We have his strongly Leninist moment of associating party politics with the discourse of the analyst. And more recently, what is this new ambiguous position, which I think here brought him closer actually to quite a mainstream position in psychoanalysis. Perhaps not the Millerian one, but another very common idea, which is, our times are of disorientation, therefore we need master signifiers that rehabilitate the master. People are just locked in a fantasy that I can do without this. And so there is a kind of sequence of ideas in Zizek's dealings with the discourses. But, I believe that this is one of those questions that are actually poorly framed. I don't think it's just a matter of rearranging or revising the discourses. I think that, again, perhaps it's time to look at them from a different perspective and ask, okay, can they really address more concrete political challenges we have, or are they meant to kind of, are they part of this other paradigm where we thought we could address social formations through discourse formations, right? There's a whole bunch of issues there, but I don't know. I have the impression that, for example, mastery, how does it play when you try to situate psychoanalysis or analytic tools as part of the toolkit for militants who are engaged in actual work? I think that the question of mastery is no longer is the question of the master's discourse, the relation to knowledge. Those things, okay, fine, you might see that. But just as people don't use those terms, like discourse theory is not a clinical theory, people don't use it in clinics. Like, yeah, my patient was engaging too much with the university discourse. Yeah, fine, that's not a really clinical description, I'm not going to act on this. So also in political practice, I think if you want to find tools there, it's not through the discourse of the master you're going to look at it, right? I mean, I think thinking in terms of anxiety, of identification in a group, or how, sometimes coordinating around one person is easier than coordinating a more distributed, less clear organizational structure. I think those things, are easier or easier to use. Or, for example, pay attention to what sort of fantasy of enjoyment might be supposed in a person who is in a position of leadership, A whole bunch of dynamics in organizations are based simply on supposing that people who take up leadership positions are enjoying that position. And sometimes it's actually the experience from the other side is the inverse, that they are sacrificing, they're not being recognized for working a lot. A lot of people are allowed to, let's say, enjoy their free rides as sympathizers who don't really engage because they ascribe, kind of perverse enjoyment to those who take up more of militant work. So that the singular dealing with these formations, which are always slightly different, even if we know we should look for them, that's much more interesting than, from the perspective we're discussing here, than discussing what to do about Lacan's discourse. Perhaps it's time not to do anything about it. There are other things to do. So I think this brings us to the question of, free association. I feel like you're coming from a position of asking, okay, how can we implement this? Is this a model? Is this a prescription? And again, if you go back to clinical practice as our kind of treasure trove of ideas, that's not what free association is in the clinic. Like, nobody's telling the patient, go free associate. Like, it's impossible to free associate. If you think about it, like, if you try to free associate and you truly start saying crazy things, like connecting things wildly, you're doing what the analyst told you. So you're not freely associating, you're doing as you're told. And if you start talking about topic X rather than topic Y, we can always ask, why did you do this? Since you could do it differently, right? So free association is a kind of heuristic device that allows us to be attentive to contingency there where we think, or where it might seem like there is necessity, right? Why this rather than that, if we're working under the frame that you had more freedom here than elsewhere, right? So see the question, like, why this structure rather than that structure? Why this constraint rather than that constraint? We start being able to learn something about what determines us when determinations emerge precisely at the place where we suspended them. And that's something that happens in militant work a lot. You create a space, it's supposed to be hierarchy-free, it's supposed to be, an equal footing, everyone, or it's supposed to be worried about, getting to some objective. And suddenly other constraints, other dynamics, other things emerge. And the temptation is always to say, well, if these things emerge, it's because bourgeois ideology, deviations, revisionism, opportunism got, the best of us. But that's exactly what we treat as fantasy in psychoanalysis, right? When new determinations appear in speech, we know the patient will try to signify them by accounting for them with regards to another's power over them. And our role is to distinguish, okay, sometimes that's true, but sometimes that's actually a fantasy to protect you from the fact that there are more structural constraints to speech, structural constraints that pile up in our personal histories, right? So the same intuition is valid for political struggle, okay? Under the principle of free association of people, meaning it's contingent when people don't freely associate. It's the mark that they could have done otherwise. When some structures emerge there where they could have not emerged, right? We're allowed to ask, okay, what sort of underlying constraint is actually, responsible for this dynamic setting in? And again, it becomes a singular, localized question dealing with an arrangement of power, of deliberating structures and so on, that we then can intervene upon, and not totally trust the discourse that is produced on top of it. Like, I'll just leave you with a last question, or a last kind of provocation. Have you realized that we don't have any names, any concepts in leftist, militant, kind of vulgar Marxist tradition to name? Holy shit, I think there's a car accident nearby. Anyway, talking about accidents, do you realize that we don't have any names or concepts for situations in which an organization autonomized itself or gained some life of its own, went in a different direction than the organized people wanted? That is not a depreciative or negative or name that implies powerlessness or moral wrongdoing, right? So usually we call it organization was bureaucratized, ossified. It detached itself from the people. It got revisionists, got the best, opportunists. You have all names for deviations that we know where they deviated to. We don't have names for when organizations detach themselves from their original ends because some other structure emerged. And what that means is still open for determination, meaning something new happened and we might make use of it rather than simply say, okay, if it's not going the way we want it, then something went wrong. We might just have kind of that sort of strange plasticity or kind of cunning that we see so often when discussing the drive in clinical settings, right? So I find it very, very interesting and very telling that we don't have operators for those sorts of situations. When new structures emerge from within our plans, and we might want to have to deal with them, handle them, and not simply make them disappear or, consider them necessarily poisonous to political practice. So I think that's the sort of thing we can start thinking, now.
We appreciate your support of the imprint and the channel. Subscribe to Zer0 Books today on Patreon. Your material support helps us to promote a variety of perspectives on the left. Also, discover the many titles, new and old, that Zer0 has curated. Navigate to any of the links in the show notes to extend your support.